If you're anything like me, you've become increasingly numb to the slow, suffocating death of the NHS in this country. But let's stop pretending that it's just a series of unfortunate, isolated failures. What we're witnessing is the steady collapse of a system that was once the pride of Britain. Now, it's become an unmanageable behemoth, bloated with inefficiency, complacency, and, ultimately, lives lost in the waiting. And that's the tragic reality we must face. The NHS is beyond saving in its current form. Look, I know we're supposed to be discussing Donald Trump's tariffs today, but I've had a personal experience that puts everything into sharp perspective. A stark contrast between the NHS's decaying framework and a functioning healthcare system abroad. My son, a teenager in Seoul, South Korea, had bronchitis. Now, as a parent, you can imagine the sheer panic that runs through you when you receive a call saying your child is in hospital. But what happened next? In under 15 minutes, he was diagnosed, treated, and sent on his way, with the entire process costing less than the lunch I'd just bought from Tesco. Let that sink in. He was tested for COVID, given antibiotics, painkillers, and a prescription, all within a span of 15 minutes, and at a cost lower than what it would take to buy a pre-packaged meal deal. Now contrast that with the grim state of the NHS. We all know the stats by now. Over 7.5 million people waiting for treatment in England alone. And that's before we even talk about the absurd delays in Scotland. Sir Keir Starmer's recent attempt to commend the progress made in England's health system in the face of such overwhelming figures is laughable. Yes, a few waiting times have improved, but the fact remains that millions are still stuck on lists, waiting months for treatment. And the situation in Scotland? Worse. 1 in 6 Scots is on a waiting list, and over 60,000 Scots have been waiting for tests or treatments for over a year. That's a staggering 46% increase in just 1 year. If you're tempted to claim that comparing our NHS with South Korea's healthcare system is an unfair or inaccurate comparison, let's not kid ourselves. The reality is simple. A functional healthcare system doesn't leave its citizens languishing for months or even years, waiting for surgery or life-saving treatment. It doesn't make people feel lucky to have had their procedure rescheduled multiple times, with no firm promise of when the next attempt might happen. Yet that's the unfortunate truth of the NHS today. Let's talk about what the NHS has become, a dysfunctional, bureaucratic nightmare. The delays are more than just numbers. They represent real people, real suffering. The government's inability to address this crisis stems from a toxic mixture of underfunding, mismanagement, and, frankly, a lack of accountability. NHS managers are insulated from the consequences of their failures, and no one is held responsible when patients suffer due to systemic inefficiencies. This is not just a bad policy. This is an ongoing disaster, and it's one that's getting worse. It's time we stop clinging to the myth of the NHS as a national treasure that can do no wrong. It's time to face the hard truth. Our healthcare system, in its current form, is failing the people it's meant to serve. And if we continue to allow this slow decline to continue, we are complicit in the suffering that results. The NHS needs radical reform, whether that means decentralizing power, investing in new management structures, or even looking at new models of healthcare entirely. But, instead, what do we get from politicians like Keir Starmer? A celebration of minor improvements in waiting times while completely ignoring the broader and far more devastating issues plaguing the system. We're told to be grateful for these incremental changes, as though it's enough to prevent us from screaming in frustration at the injustice of it all. We're told to be patient, to wait our turn, and to accept that delays are just part of the system. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous. People are dying while waiting for care, and the government seems either oblivious or uninterested in addressing the scale of the crisis. The truth is, the NHS, as it currently exists, can't be fixed without a complete overhaul. No amount of lip service or promises of future investment will change the fact that the system is fundamentally broken. And don't for a moment think that your local MP, or even Sir Keir Starmer, will offer you the solution. The political class is too entrenched in defending the status quo, afraid to even acknowledge the obvious flaws in the system. The question is, when will we stop making excuses and demand a system that actually serves the needs of its people? I'm not saying that the NHS doesn't have value. Of course it does. Many of its workers are doing their absolute best under impossible conditions. But the system they work in is failing, and continuing to prop it up as some kind of untouchable institution is a disservice to them and the millions of patients waiting for care. We need to face facts. The NHS, in its current form, is not fit for purpose. And it's time for a serious conversation about its future. before more lives are lost waiting in vain.